An Appetite for Wonder is the name of the book. The author, Dr. Richard Dawkins, who has written The God Delusion, as well as The Selfish Gene bestseller. Dr. Dawkins, why did you choose to write an autobiography at this point?
Well, I'm getting on a bit, and it seemed like a good moment to do so. My mother is 96 and is a very useful resource for me to go and tap her memories, and it's been a wonderful experience actually, in effect, interviewing her to write the book. It seemed like the right time to do it. This is in fact just the first half. This is up to the age of 35, up to when I wrote The Selfish Gene, which marks a sort of natural watershed in my life, I suppose, and so it did make sense to divide it into two books. This is the first one, taking me through childhood, school days, university, early work as a scientist, and up to writing The Selfish Gene at the age of 35.
Well, why was The Selfish Gene a natural halfway point for you, in a sense?
The Selfish Gene changed my life. I mean, before that I was an ordinary research scientist, sort of in a white lab coat. And then after The Selfish Gene, I stayed on the faculty at Oxford and went on teaching and went on doing some research, but I became, I suppose, more of a public figure writing books for large audiences.
Who were John and Jean Dawkins?
John and Jean were my parents. They were, well, my mother is still alive. My father was a biologist. He did botany at Oxford, so his career began rather similarly to mine. We went to the same kind of school, sort of fee-paying, rather expensive English schools, Anglican schools. And then he read botany at Oxford, whereas I read zoology at Oxford. He did research, I did research. Then he went into the British Colonial Service, which was a thing one did in those days, you don't anymore of course, and was posted to Nyasaland, which is now Malawi, in Central East Africa, and then was called up to fight in the war against the Italians in Abyssinia and Somaliland. And I was born around that time. My mother was an art student, came of Cornish family, and they had a shared love of wild things, wild flowers. Both of them knew all the wild flowers, and so I was brought up in an atmosphere of scientific inquiry and love of nature.
Were you brought up in the Anglican Church?
My parents had no interest in religion, but I was sent to Anglican schools. It was rather difficult not to. I mean, that's again a thing that normally happened. It was quite hard to find a school that wasn't in some way churchy.
And when did you lose that connection?
I suppose finally at the age of about 16, when I was at school. But I had my doubts from earlier. I think I first of all had my doubts around the age of about 9, when my mother pointed out to me that there were lots of different religions, and the one I was brought up in was not the only one.
So when you asked your parents about religion, about God, how did they respond?
I think my mother told me the standard sort of Christian stories, as though she believed them, which I think she didn't. Then when I went to school, I got it all from school.
Richard Dawkins, how did The Selfish Gene come about as a book?
Well, about 10 years before I wrote it, in 1966, I was asked by my boss, the Nobel Prize-winning scientist Nico Tinbergen, if I would stand in and give his lectures for him. He was on sabbatical leave. And I wrote a course of lectures in animal behavior, which pretty much foreshadowed the rhetoric of The Selfish Gene, the idea of immortal genes bounding through the generations, discarding a succession of bodies. All that rhetoric was in those lectures in 1966. And I vaguely thought at some point I might write it all down. And I finally did so in 1976, when The Selfish Gene was published. But you can find in The Selfish Gene almost the same words as the lectures that I gave in 1966. So I don't know why I delayed so long. I think I actually started to put, not pen to paper, but typewriter key to paper in about 1972 or 73 when there was a strike in Britain. So there were frequent power cuts, frequent electricity cuts, and I couldn't do my research. So I thought, well, now's the time to start writing that long promised book.
Because you didn't need electricity.
Didn't need electricity in those days, a manual typewriter.
In An Appetite for Wonder, you talk about John Maynard Smith.
Yes.
Who is he? Who was he?
He was a very wonderful man. He was a very distinguished biologist, a very wonderful character. Students loved him. He was funny, irreverent, constantly talking to students about real work. He didn't do any of the things that professors do, like fuss about where the next grant is coming from, anything like that. He just got on with it. And his tools of the trade were pretty much a pencil and paper because he was a theorist. And he inspired generations of students. He inspired me, although I was never actually his student. And many of his ideas are incorporated in The Selfish Gene, play a big role in The Selfish Gene.
After The Selfish Gene was published, how did your life change as a professor? Did you become a celebrity professor in a sense?
Not immediately. The book did sell very well, and I think it sold well over 1 million copies in total. It did cause a bit of a sensation, and I did find myself being invited to do lots of things which I hadn't been before, I suppose. Talking to people like you, I suppose. That did start to happen then, and I suppose it did change my life and set me on a new course of writing other books after that.
Well, here in the States, you're quite well known not only as a scientist, but also as an atheist. When did you start writing about that in earnest?
The Selfish Gene has intimations of that, and it doesn't conceal the fact. And I suppose all my books, I mean, the next book I wrote for a popular audience, which was The Blind Watchmaker, is all about the argument from design, which is still, I think, the dominant reason why most people will give for believing in a supreme being. They will say, look at the world of nature, look at the trees, look at the birds, look at the flowers. It's all too complicated to come about by chance. And of course it is too complicated to come about by chance. That's not what it's about. It came about by natural selection, which is the opposite of chance. And so The Blind Watchmaker was an attempt to explain that to people, and was taken as an atheistic book by many people. Indeed, I think the subtitle in America was something like Why the Evidence of Evolution Shows a Universe Without Design, or something of that sort. So The Blind Watchmaker was at least interpreted as an atheistic book, and all my other books since then could be interpreted in the same way. The only book that is explicitly and at length atheistic is The God Delusion, published in 2006, which is, I think that's my biggest seller, in fact. That sold more than 2 million copies in English, and I don't know how many in about 30 foreign languages. But apart from that, my books haven't been devoted to atheism in the way that The God Delusion has.
Charles Darwin, your hero, you say, in An Appetite for Wonder.
Indeed, yes. And Charles Darwin was a brilliant thinker, brilliant explainer. One of the things I find surprising is that Darwin's idea, which is really so simple, I mean, anybody should be able to understand it, came so late. It came 200 years after Newton. And really, you might think that what Newton did was cleverer, more difficult to think of. I mean, inventing calculus, working out optics, understanding gravity, the laws of mechanics, the laws of motion. These are all supreme achievements of the human mind. 200 years before Darwin, and you can't help wondering why somebody like Newton, or indeed Aristotle, didn't think of Darwin's really simple but immensely powerful idea.
Richard Dawkins is somebody who's written about science, written about ideas. What was it like to write about yourself?
Quite difficult. There's a certain embarrassment factor in writing about yourself, and I was persuaded by both the British and American publishers that it was worth doing, that I should do it and I should